My name is Daniela Candillari, and I'm a conductor. A little bit about my background. I was born in Serbia in a family that was quite divided, I would say, in sort of the things that we did. My mother and my father were athletes, and my grandmother was an opera singer. So I didn't discover I had an athletic bone or a gene in me as it was strong with the rest of my family. But what I discovered very, very early on was that I was drawn to the theater and to music since I was 5. And that led me to start piano studies when I was 5, to start playing piano when I was 5. And I knew always that I wasn't going to be a concert pianist. There was nothing about that lifestyle that particularly spoke to me highly. But what I was always interested was learning scores and playing music with other people. And eventually, through my life, I started getting interested in languages. I was always interested in opera. I was always interested in all sorts of music. I actually also thought I was going to be a singer at some point, which I thought piano and my curiosity about music would give me a very strong foundation in how music works and how one can be a better musician. And when I was quite young, my mother and then my stepdad moved to Slovenia, so I followed them. And shortly after a 2-year sort of stint in Slovenia of just finishing my primary school, I started studying piano performance at the music university in Graz. So that, of course, fueled further my love for languages, and I was exposed to people from all over the world who were all gathered in Austria and studying different instruments at a really high level. And I still the only sort of concern that I had was to study music as much as possible and to understand the complexities of it. And I still also had this idea that someday maybe I'll be a singer. But life takes us in the direction that it does, and it took me to where I am now. So fast forward a couple of years later, I applied to Indiana University initially on a Fulbright scholarship. I had finished my master's in piano performance in Austria, in Graz, and I started my doctorate studies in musicology in Vienna, and then I applied for Fulbright scholarship, which led me to Indiana University, it was my first time leaving the European continent. So the exposure to people from even more cultures and getting exposition to everything that happens at Indiana University was truly the best thing that could have happened to me. I studied with Emil Naumov as a Fulbright scholar in piano, but then I was accepted into masters in jazz studies with David Baker and Luke Gillespie and Brent Walrab and the entire jazz faculty. So I sort of led this double life while at Indiana University. I was a jazz studies major, but I was also an associate assistant, I think was the title, in opera department as a vocal coach. So my love for opera continued in that, and I would work on 3 or 4 operas every season with fantastic conductors, and I also ended up playing a lot for conducting studio. And shortly after I graduated, my first job offer came from Indiana University to coach German diction on a production of Arabella. And by that point, I had met enough conductors who all sort of would pull me aside and said, "We think you might need to start conducting. We think there's something that you need to explore." And it took me a really long time to accept that. And after my first employment at Indiana University, I graduated here. I got my doctorate in Vienna, and then I was full-time faculty at Indiana University for 2 years in opera studies in the opera department. I went back to Slovenia and started working as a vocal coach at the Slovenia National Opera in Maribor, which is my second hometown. And there again, the same story kept on repeating. We would have guest conductors, and they would say, "We think you're a conductor. You should really give this a try." And it really wasn't until life and situation forced me into that situation where I had to just try it out and see what happens. And to my massive surprise, all of the people that sort of gave me that idea that I should conduct were absolutely right. Because I found myself completely being in the moment of creating music with 40 people in the chorus, with all of the soloists, really listening intently to what was going on in the orchestra. And I thought, oh, this is what I should be doing. And after 3 years in Slovenia at the National Opera, I moved to New York City. And I started freelancing initially as a pianist and a vocal coach, and then again I started sort of rising up in the operatic production world. So I started assisting a lot. I started working as a chorus master, and then eventually started leading my own productions, which leads me to being now at Indiana University conducting a production of La Bohème, which is also full circle, as La Bohème was the first opera that I played here when I was a student. So classical music was, for me, always an anchor in many ways. When I reflect back and when I think about sort of different curiosities that I've had, I always kept on. As I mentioned earlier, I still do. I have vast tastes in music. I'm interested in jazz. I'm interested in R&B and pop and rock and folk music and so on. But there is something about classical music that always draws me back and speaks to me on a very different level than other music does, perhaps. And when I also look at composers, I love finding about composers and sort of what their influences were. I love finding about Puccini that in a lot of his operas, he would actually take the folk music, the Italian folk music, and integrate it into this musical language that he created. And in a way, it might sound cliche, but I also find the classical music has this endurance. It's been around as all music. It's been around for such a long time. And I think it's also a medium that connects us on a deeper emotional level, on deeper humanitarian level as human beings. I think that we can really go into a concert hall, we can go into a production and learn something else about ourselves. We can learn something different about the world. We can engage in a different type of conversation with our colleagues that we work with. Um, and at the end of all of that, what I strongly believe in opera is such a collaborative art form. And I always believe that the strongest teams that we build in opera also have a possibility of capturing audiences to the most authentic and honest way. And communicating that, having a chance to communicate that with a majority of people is something that is really, really unique and really, truly special. And those are the moments that I find myself always being inspired by. Those are the moments that I myself experience when I go to hear other performers. That just makes make life worth living in a way. Well, I think right now we're living in sort of untested territories in the music, how it's being created, and different influences that we have in music. Social media is certainly playing a part. And while I personally am on social media, I'm also trying to limit my time of how much I'm there and how much I absorb all of it. The placement of classical music in today's society is a big question, and I think when I look back, I think there was probably a similar conversation that was happening in early 1900s when, or later when LPs were starting to be produced and recorded. I think there are parallels that we can perhaps look back and figure out a way to live and create within this world and use AI and use all of these things um, to help us navigate through the work that we need to do. But what I always come back to is really the human connection that we have to music, that we have from writing things on a piece of paper that get our imprint into music that fortunately AI cannot really replicate. And we can't really the level of humanity that goes into music making, I think, will never be paralleled by AI or by extraneous things that are in our world right now. So maybe I'm naive and maybe I'm too optimistic, but I always do think that we have created AI, therefore we can actually control how much it influences our work, how much it gets into our work, and how we utilize it to improve our work, whether that just goes through simple tasks of looking up programs or coming up with ideas or maybe a starting question that can actually help us get through a programming element. um, I think maybe those are the ways that we can somehow separate the real from the manufacturing aspect of those two worlds that are competing now against each other. Coming to Jacob School of Music, I quite didn't know what to expect. I knew it was a fantastic music school. I also remember specifically on my Fulbright application, that was my first choice of school. And I had friends who were already studying here, but of course, I've never visited. And the sentiment that I got from all of my friends who were here already was that it is an incredible place where one can experiment and get different influences. And you can also create a little bit of your path in at the university yourself. And creating a path meaning sort of letting your curiosities guide you to what you really want to know. So studying jazz in a way was the best thing that could have happened to me artistically and creatively because it taught me how to listen on a very different level, how to read different types of music, how to read chord progressions, and how to also think in colors a little bit more than perhaps what we're used to in classical world. It also taught me how to get away from the sheet music and treat it as something that is a bit more flexible, that still has room for interpretation and really, really to listen a lot more. So if I were to go back in time, I would say to my younger self to absolutely follow my curiosities and follow whatever makes me light up, to just be fully present there and to absorb it all and see what comes out. And we never know. We can I forget now who said that quote, but we can always connect the dots going backwards. We can never anticipate what will happen. We can never sort of in musical life we can never plan a competition that we might win or a job that we might get. It is those things are so out of our control. But what is in our control is how we show up and what curiosities we have and how we nurture that. When I graduated here, I graduated with masters in jazz studies, and I had experience um, coaching opera. And I mean, I didn't know where life was going to take me, honestly. I was still sort of selfishly, one of the reasons I wanted to get into opera was so that my playing would improve as well, that I would get a lot more colors, but it was also to learn vocal techniques so that I could, emulate what Shirley Horn was doing and do it on with the longevity. But I also think that sometimes life puts us in the place where we need to be, and sometimes jobs, sort of professions seek us out. And I think if one has the courage to trust that and follow that, it can be really a spectacular journey. When I decided I was taking private conducting lessons, when I started conducting, and so when I decided to fully follow that path, I applied to a couple of conducting seminars. I didn't get into any of them because I didn't have the conducting school behind me. I was sort of really an outlier in the field of conducting, and perhaps in the way that my musical life has shaped me, or I have shaped it. um, I was really an outlier in every single field. And at the moment, it was frustrating because you don't, there's no, there's no recipe for how you get your first job. There's no such thing. So you kind of have to think creatively. And again, you have to follow your instinct and just sort of show what you can do. So in many, many ways now, when I look back, I think that not getting accepted into certain things was actually the best thing that could have happened. And you never know. There are so many ways to exist in our world. There are so many ways to be a musician. Uh, but what I always like to encourage people to do is to really learn what it is that they want to say and really stick to it. And for some people, programs that follow a traditional route are the perfect place. For me, it wasn't. And the sort of biggest lesson in all of that is a path can be the best one that we choose to be for ourselves. It doesn't need to be one or the other. Both can work. It just depends what works for us. And sort of that's in a way the biggest lesson and the biggest learning that I've had so far.